So let's dive into part 2 of 4, dealing with our chapter 28. Also with our female reproductive system, we're going to look at the menopause, look at puberty, as well as the functions of these hormones that are going to be secreted, and the various stages that are going to take part within this. And there's some other stuff as well. So let's talk about puberty. Puberty begins at age 8 to 10 for most girls in the United States and in Europe. Now, in other countries, it is some of the females will get their puberty a lot later in age. Now, what triggers it? Well, we see that the increase of these GnRH. But before I even go on to this, studies have shown, there's one study that was conducted in 1997, and it showed that, let's see, that's 1,700 girls. Out of 1,700 girls, 3% African American and 1% white or Caucasian female, began their periods began puberty at age 3. But then of that 7,000 study members or subjects, 27% of black or African American females and 7% Caucasian females began their puberty by age 7. So, how are these hormones even triggered? They're triggered by the hypothalamus, mainly by the hypothalamus. That hypothalamus is going to stimulate. So, let me see if I can get my paper out. The hypothalamus, as you know, is already in the brain. It's not really to size, I'm sorry. But we have our hypothalamus here. So the hypothalamus, the hypothalamus now, it contains a number of hormones. And this hormone will increase. And this one that we're going to deal with is our G lowercase n RH. Now, when this GnRH increases, this is what's in the hypothalamus. All right. When this GnRH increases, we're going to have a secretion of. This is my secretion. I'm going to have a secretion of my FSH and my LH, and these are found within the pituitary gland. And we do have an anterior and a posterior, but you guys should know or remember, dealing with our endocrine system, our pituitary gland. All right. So once these are secreted, we have our FH. This FH here, FSH, sorry. This one, it actually stimulates the development of our ovarian follicles. Don't mind my writing. You guys follow along in the textbook or with your PowerPoints. With our ovarian follicles, which in turn are going to secrete about 4 hormones. We have our estrogen, our progesterone, our inhibin, INHIBIN, and our androgen, but just small amounts of this androgen. Alright, so the estrogen are the feminizing hormones. Our feminizing hormones, which are used in a number of effects dealing with female development. And they will include estradiol, sorry. These are my three E's, my estradiol, my estriol, and my estrone. Okay. Now, any type of visual effects. The most visual changes within the female body occurs from my estradiol and my androgen. So remember these two. Okay? So I'm going to go back to my slide. Okay. Alright, so the information I was just talked about are here. Don't forget it, please. Alright, so once these hormones are released, they're into the body, and it's around that age where puberty is going to start. It goes through 3 stages. My T, P, M. Those are my 3 stages. First one, T, stands for thalarch. This is when the breast starts to develop. This is the onset of breast development, and it's often the earliest noticeable sign of puberty. Now, the estrogen, the cortisol, the prolactin, they induce the formation of the lobules and the ducts. So they're going to start triggering these ducts to start developing and start forming. Now, the duct development is completed under the influence of the glucocorticoids and my GH, my growth hormone. Now, adipose and fibrous tissue do help with enlarging the breast size. Now, breast development is completed around age 20, but changes occur each menstrual cycle, and of course, you have major changes that occur during pregnancy. Now, my second stage, my pubertic stage, is the next stage, and it includes the appearance of pubic and axillary hair, sebaceous glands, and my axillary glands. Now, androgen from the ovaries and the adrenal cortex, it stimulates the pubarch as well as the libido. So women, they secrete about 1.5 milligrams of androgen per day, and men they secrete 6 to 8 milligrams per day of androgen. This last stage is marked by the first menstrual period. Now, in Europe and America, the average age of monarch has declined from 16.5 back in 1860 to age 12 in 1997. So you're looking at back in the 1800s, you had females having a menstrual cycle. So in the very first menstrual cycle, at about 16 and a half years old, and 1997 it was an average of age 8. Now in the past 10 years or so, it has actually dropped to about 9. So you have females at 9 years old obtaining a menstrual cycle. So I'm hoping that in the next 10 to 20 years it does not drop to 5 years old, because that would not be fair. Very unfair to these young children at that age to have to go through all that, to remember to deal with all these changes in their body. Alright, so the menarche cannot occur until a girl has attained about 17% body fat. So that could be a reason as to why females are getting their the menstrual cycle a lot earlier, because of the increase of our body fat. The foods that they're consuming, that's high in fat, very sedentary compared to back in 1997, back in the 90s, the 80s, 70s, everything prior to the 90s or the 200s. Activity has definitely decreased. So, adult menstruation ceases if the body fat drops below 22%, which is about the minimum needed to sustain pregnancy and lactation. So you do have some females that do they may have their very first menstrual cycle, but due to the very rigorous sports that they may take part in, like since like gymnastics, which is very gymnastics and ballet, where they're very skeptical, very cruel with how you're supposed to look on the floor, and making sure that you stay extremely thin, which can also hinder how frequent your menstrual cycle will occur, as well as when will the very first one occur. Okay, now what monitors the body fat is the brain. The brain is going to monitor it, and it monitors it from the amount of leptin in the blood. Alright, so now the leptin, which I don't have a slide for that, but when you talk about the leptin is what stimulates the gonadotropin secretion, in addition to regulating appetite. Now, if the leptin falls, the gonadotropin levels will decline and the estrogen will cease. You won't have that estrogen. So we're talking about leptin, L-I-P-T-I-N. Let me see if it's on the other slide. No, it's not here. Let me see if I can type it in here quick. No, type it in here, but this is the leptin that you find in the blood. The brain is what deals or notifies whether or not it monitors the amount of of body fat from the amount of leptin in the blood. So if there is a low amount of leptin, you know what we'll have? We'll have a decrease in our gonadotropin, and it will eventually, I can't get over there, decrease or stop or cease menstruation. It's all what's in the blood, the leptin. So you will see that word again. You will see leptin again. So make sure you understand what role leptin plays in the menstrual cycle, even beginning. Alright, so monarch does not necessarily signify fertility. It doesn't mean the person is fertile. The first few menstrual cycles are typically takes place where has no ovulation. Where with the first few menstrual cycles, there's no ovulation taking place. So if you have your first, your second, and your third menstrual cycle, it doesn't mean that you will become pregnant, because no ovulation is going to take place. And it's called anovulatory. Alright, so let's move on to the next slide. And look at these hormones. So we're looking at estrol and progesterone. Now, estrol, it stimulates many other changes of puberty, such as vaginal metaplasia, growth of the ovaries and secondary sex organs, and stimulation of the growth hormone secretion. Now, when you do that growth hormone secretion, you have a rapid increase of height and the weight and the widening, of the pelvis. The feminine physique develops because of the stimulation of the fat deposits. And of course, our skin is a lot thinner, softer, and warmer than our counterparts, our males. Now, the progesterone, it acts primarily on the uterus, preparing it for possible pregnancy in the second half of each menstrual cycle. Now, the estrogen and the progesterone also suppress the FSH and the LH secretion through negative inhibition. So once the estrogen and the progesterone are released and occurring and helping with the stimulation or the development of various body parts, it's going to stop this FSH and the LH from secreting, because their purpose is to secrete so that we can get these particular hormones within the body to start the process. But if we've had enough and the body has developed or is in the process of development, and certain areas have developed as much as it's going to develop, it sends a signal back saying, you know what, we've had enough. Pituitary gland, stop secreting. It sends back to the hypothalamus saying, hey, we don't need any more. So the hypothalamus will stop secreting that GnRH, and the pituitary, and which in turn will stop the secretion of the FSH and RLH. All right. Now inhibin, which we talked about inhibin. Sorry. No. Sorry. Went ahead. All right. So inhibin here selectively suppresses the FSH, because you know FSH is the one that helps with the development of the ovarian follicles. So the inhibin selectively suppresses this FSH. Alright, so males, they secrete high levels of androgen and low levels of estrogen, and females secrete the opposite relative amounts. So I'm gonna write it in here. Hopefully you guys are writing down, even though you don't see it here. It's still your responsibility to write it down. Just because I don't say it doesn't mean because it's not here doesn't mean it won't appear on your test. So male sex hormones are secreted more or less continually and simultaneous, and in female secretion is distinctly cyclic and in a sequence. So females, they have a sequence with things. Always want things in order. Gotta be in order, but the male secretion is distinctly cyclic. Sorry, not cyclic, is basically continuum and spontaneous. Alright, so with male secretion, they have, in males, so if you guys are males, what do we have? We have high levels of androgen, and they have low levels of estrogen. And in females, it's the opposite. So what do we have? We have high levels of estrogen and low levels of this androgen. Don't mind the writing. Alright, so let's move on to the next slide. Oops, let's see if we can get rid of it. Okay, good. Alright, women, like men, go through a midlife change in hormone secretion called climacteric. Now, in women, it is occupied or is accompanied by menopause, the sensation of menstruation. Now, a female is born with about 2 million eggs, each in its own follicle. Now, climacteric begins when a female has only about 1,000 follicles remaining. So that's nothing much compared to the 2 million that we start off with. Alright, so climacteric begins, where said that? Now the remaining follicles are less responsive to the gonadotropins. So they secrete less estrogen and less progesterone. Now without these steroids, the uterus, the vagina, and the breasts start to atrophy. So they start to get smaller and with muscle or just in size. Now, intercourse may become uncomfortable and vaginal infections more common. Now, the skin becomes thinner. Cholesterol levels are going to rise, and your bone mass, the bone mass density decreases. And then we have the blood vessels. What happens to the blood vessels? Blood vessels constrict and dilate in response to the shifting of the hormone balances, which can also cause the hot flashes. So depending how your hormones are moving, if it's high, if it's low, you're gonna have these blood vessels either constricting, which is really closing, which is less blood vessels to the particular area, or they're gonna dilate. So that's where you have sometimes women go through those hot flashes where they're sweating a lot, or they're cold, It just has to do with the hormone imbalance. Alright, so many physicians, they're going to prescribe what? Hormone replacement therapy. You guys have seen the commercials. They're always talking about menopause, different hormone replacement therapies. But the risks and the benefits are a matter of debate. There are a number of issues that can occur while on this hormone, while going through hormone therapy. So menopause. Menopause is a cessation of menstrual cycles, usually occurring between the ages of 45 and 55, with an average age of about 52 currently. Menstrual periods may become irregular during this time, stopping for several months and then starting over again. Now, menopause is considered to have occurred when there has been no menstruation for a year or more. So let's look at the evolution of menopause. Now, in theory, older women would not live long enough to rear an infant to a survivable age. It's better to become infertile and help raise their grandchildren. Now, the Ice Age showed earlier hominids rarely lived past the age of 40. Now, menopause may be an artifact of modern nutrition and medicine, allowing us to live longer than our ancestors. Alright, so let's look at our sexual cycle, Oogenesis. Oogenesis. Alright, so we're going to look at the various changes in the ovarian follicles, as well as the process of egg production, and some other stuff. So let's go on. I'm going to look at this. Let's go through these two definitions first. We have the reproductive cycle and we have the sexual cycle. The reproduction cycle is a sequence of events from fertilization to giving birth, and then continuing to fertility. The sexual cycle occurs, basically are events that reoccur every month when pregnancy does not intervene. So there's a difference between the two. Now, it consists of two interrelated cycles controlled by shifting patterns of hormone secretion. What are those two cycles? Ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. The ovarian cycle deals with the events in the ovaries, and the menstrual cycle deals with changes in the uterus. When there's no egg that's fertilized, you have changes within the uterus, because basically it's supposed to be preparing for it, but nothing's there, and it has to make these proper changes. So let us look at this diagram. Alright, just like spermatogenesis, the oogenesis produces haploid gametes via meiosis. Okay? But there are several differences. We look at the males. Males, they produce sperm continuously, whereas oogenesis is distinctly cyclic event, is distinctly a cyclic event that continually releases only one egg per month. Now, oogenesis is accompanied by cyclic changes in hormone secretion and in the histological structure of the ovaries and the uterus. Alright, so look up here. We're dealing with the female germ cell. When it arises, it's just like those of the males. It comes from the yolk sac of the embryo. Now, these cells are going to colonize the gonadal ridges in the first 5 to 6 weeks of development. Then they're going to differentiate into oogonia. Oogonia, right there. That's that word here. Now, the oogonia, they were going to multiply until the 5th month of development, reaching 6 to 7 million in number, and then go into a state of arrested development until shortly after birth. Now at that time, some of them transform into primary oocytes. Get this working here. Here we go. Into the primary oocytes and go as far as early meiosis 1, which is here. Now all of them reach this stage by 6 months after birth, and no ogona remain behind at that time. Any stage from the primary oocyte to the time of fertilization can be called an egg or an ovum. Now the primary oocyte undergoes a process of degeneration called astrea. Let's spell that word here. Atrestia. And this occurs before a girl is born. Alright, keep this back. Okay, good. Alright, so we have 2 million that are going to remain at the time of birth, and most of these are going to undergo astrea until childhood. Now by puberty, you have only 400,000 primary, these are these here, 400,000 primary oocytes that remain, and more than ample supply that we'll have. Okay. Now egg development resumes in adolescence when monthly cohorts of oocytes complete meiosis 1, stimulated by our FSH. And we talked about FSH a little bit earlier. Now each oocyte divides into 2 haploid daughter cells of unequal size, and then different destinies. So here they are dividing. Okay, so the 2 haploid daughter cells are secondary oocyte and a much smaller first polar body, which ultimately disintegrates. So the second, okay, that's right. Now the secondary oocyte, it proceeds to metaphase 2. So here we have metaphase 2 occurring, and then arrests until after ovulation. Now if over here we have one that won't fertilize and you have others that will fertilize. The one that does not fertilize, it will die. It completes the meiosis 2, and they cast off a second polar body containing only 1 chromatid from each chromosome. The chromosome of the large remaining egg unite with those of the sperm. Now, unlike the spermatogenesis, which produces like 4 equal sized sperms in the oogocyte, unlike the spermagogenesis, which produces 4 equal sized sperm, in oogenesis only 1 mature cell is produced. Now egg must be produced with as much cytoplasm as possible to support its repeated division if it is to be fertilized. Alright, so as an egg, it undergoes this oogenesis, which is on this side. As it undergoes this oogenesis, the follicle around it undergoes development called folliculogenesis. So after it's finished here, it's going to go through this stage. It's the folliculogenesis. Now a primordial follicle consists of a primary oocyte in early meiosis, and then it's surrounded. You see this layer It has a layer of these follicle cells and a basement membrane separating the follicle from the stroma of the ovary. So here's the cells, here's the oocyte, and it has these follicle cells surrounding it. Now the follicle cells are connected to the oocyte, as you see here, but by a very fine cytoplasmic process that allows the passage of nutrients and chemical signals. You see that will go through. Now the primordial follicles are concentrated in the cortex of the ovary, close to the capsule. Now they begin to appear as early as 12 weeks of embryonic development. They persist into adulthood with much waiting at least 13 years, with most waiting at least 13 years and some as long as 50 years beyond or before development occurs. Now, in an adult, we have 90 to 95% of follicles that are primordial. Now, the primary follicle, which you see here, the primary follicles have a larger oocyte and follicle cells that still form a single layer, but are now cuboidal. So here there were squamous follicle cells, but over time they're now cuboidal. Now the secondary follicles are distinguished by a still larger oocyte and by follicle cells in 2 layers. So we have more than one layer of these follicle cells. And the follicle cells, they're stratified and now called granulosa cells. And these are the ones that are going to secrete a layer of glycoprotein gel, the zona pellucida, which are going to surround. Here we go. Which are going to surround the oocyte. So these cells here are going to secrete this here, the zona pellucida, to surround the oocyte. Then on this outer layer here is our theca folliculi, sorry. And that's that connective tissue that's going to condense from this granulosa cells. And it's that thick, it forms this nice husk around these cells, my G cells, okay? Now our tertiary follicles, they result from these granulosa cells secreting, they form, or they start to, the tertiary follicles, they result when these cells, my G cells, the granulosa cells, they secrete a follicular fluid. And those are the ones that are going to accumulate within the walls of the follicles. Now, as they begin to enlarge, these poles, they emerge and become a single fluid-filled cavity, which is called the antrum. Now, on one side of the antrum, a mound of granular cells called the cumulus ophorus. They're going to cover the oocyte. Get this mouse working again. They're going to cover the oocyte and secure it within the follicle wall. Now the inner layer of the cells in the cumulus surrounding the zona pellucida and the oocyte is the corona radiata. Now the corona radiata, they actually going to communicate with the oocyte via this cytoplasmic processing. They also ensure that nothing from the bloodstream can get to the oocyte except by passing through this cytoplasma of the corona site. And they also, this is like a protective barrier, similar to like the blood-testes barrier or the blood-brain barrier, just to make sure only nutrients are going to get in and not any type of toxins. Okay. Alright, so only one mature follicle is going to develop in each month's cohort. So each month you're just going to have one that's going to develop and is destined to ovulate with the rest, while the rest are going to degenerate. Now, as this mature follicle approaches ovulation, the cumulus ovaris, they start to constrict until the oocyte is detached. Is attached by only a narrow stalk of granular cells. Now, in the last day or so, the oocyte and the cumulus, they start to break away and float free in the antrum. Okay, so let's move on. Skip a number of slides. This was just dealing with what I was talking about, what's happening with those two processes, those two stages. So we're going to move on to the sex cycle. Now, the female sex cycle occurs 28 days in length, but commonly varies from 20 to about 45 days. Now, the basic hierarchy of control is the hypothalamus, which I keep talking about, down to the pituitary gland, and the ovaries, and the uterus. However, the ovaries also exert feedback control over the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The sex cycle, you see here, it begins with a 2-week follicle phase that begins with the onset of menstruation. And that's where you have the blood and the endometrium tissues are discarded vaginally. That's where you have they have the blood, and they have these, might look like, sorry to be very graphic with you guys, but they have these, looks like tissue, or the for those that wear certain things. You have this, you have the blood as well as these, looks like clots, but that's basically the endometrium tissue, that lining within the uterus is being discarded, and that occurs after which the uterus replaces that lost tissue, which we talked about in the last video. Now, while that's going on, we have a cohort of ovarian follicles which grow until one of them ovulates around day 14, which you see here. Now, after ovulation, the remainder of the mature follicle becomes a body called the corpus luteum. Now, over the next 2 weeks, over the next 2 weeks is called the relatal phase, and this is where we have the corpus luteum. It will stimulate the endometrial secretion, making the endometrium thicker even more. So if pregnancy does not occur, the endometrium breaks down again in the last 2 days, and the cycle will begin again. So the ovarian cycle consists of 3 primary phases. We have the follicle phase, we have the ovulation phase, and we have our luteal phase. So we're going to look at each phase in depth, so you guys can look along or follow along in your textbook, but we're going to go through each phase. So let's deal with the follicle phase. This is the phase of the ovarian cycle, and extends from 1 day, which is the beginning of menstruation, to day 14, which is ovulation. Now, the portion from the end of the menstruation until ovulation is called pre-ovulatory phase. Now, it is seldom possible to reliably predict the date of ovulation. So we never know we don't know exactly when it's going to occur, but you can always estimate. It could be a day late, a few hours late. We don't know the exact date and time as to when things are going to occur. Now, preparation for ovulatory phase actually begins almost 2 months earlier, when a new cohort of preantral follicles after ovulation in 1 month descends from the cortex deeper in the ovaries and then begins to grow. Now, each follicle develops an antrum, and by late month 2 has sustained or attained a diameter of 2 millimeters. Now, at that time, there is a 5-day selection window in which one may become the dominant follicle, while the other one will mature and ovulate. Now, going into month 3, the FSH follicle, it stimulates the growth of the follicles into the cohort, but especially of the dominant follicle. The FSH will stimulate the granular cells, which we talked about. Those are my granule cells. The granule cells to secrete estradiol, which increases the reception of the FSH, the LH, and the estradiol in the dominant follicle, and then is going to inhibit, or is going to stop the secretion of the GnRH from the hypothalamus. So does that make sense? I'll go over that last part. The FSH, which stimulates the growth of all these follicles, they're going to stimulate the granule cells to secrete the estradiol. That estradiol is going to increase the receptors of the FSH and my LH, and of course my estradiol in that dominant follicle, but it's going to stop the hypothalamus from secreting that GnRH. Now, the anterior pituitary gland secretes less and less FSH, causing the antral follicles to degenerate. However, that dominant follicle with more receptors, they will continue to grow. Now, it reaches about 20 millimeters by that late follicle stage, and then is regarded as mature. Now, during this ovulation phase, ovulation is the rupture of the mature follicle and the releasing of the egg and the attendant cells. And it's usually by day 14. Now, dramatic changes over this preceding day signifies its imminence. Now, estradiol, it stimulates the surge of my LH. Right here. And we have a lesser spike of the FSH by the pituitary gland. Now, the LH here, this is going to induce this primary oocyte to complete meiosis 1. The follicle fluid to build rapidly and swell the follicle. Now, the follicle wall, it weakens as a result of inflammation and a particular enzyme. Now, the rupturing of this follicle is basically going to happen. It is imminent. While that is occurring, remember we talked about the uterine tubes, the fallopian tubes? The fallopian tubes are going to basically prepare itself to catch this oocyte when it emerges by the swelling with edema. Now, ovulation only takes about 2 to 3 minutes. You have a nipple-like stigma that appears in the ovarian surface. It seeps the fluid, and then the follicle bursts. Now the remaining fluid that we have there, that you see here, get this working. The remaining fluid that remains, it carries the oocyte and the camelosis ophorus to its destination. Now these are normally swept into the uterine tube, although many will fall into the pelvic cavity and will die. Now in this late luteal phase, this phase occurs from day 15, as you see here, 15 to day 28, beginning just after the ovulation, and lasting until the onset of menstruation again. So when this follicle ruptures and it collapses and it bleeds into the atrium, the granulolus cells, and the legal internal cells, they start to multiply. And then they're going to fill this antrum, and a dense bed of blood capillaries that grow within them or around them. Now the ovulated follicle has now become the corpus luteum, and that's named just because of the yellow liquid that accumulates. Now this transformation is regulated by my LH, which is also called the luteotropic hormone. Now the corpus luteum continues to grow and grow, and to secrete these rising levels of these estradiol and the progesterone. The most important aspect of this phase is a 10-fold increase in the progesterone level, which is not seen here. You just see the FSH and RLH, but here you're going to have an increase of the progesterone levels. Now the LH, let me get this working here. The LH here, it declines. You see it declining. It declines steadily, and so does the LH, as the high levels of the estrogen and the progesterone occur, along with the inhibin, which has a negative effect on that pituitary gland which we were talking about, which will stop the secretion of the FH. Now, if pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum begins a process of involution or shrinkage, and this is around day 22 or 8 days after the ovulation. Now, by day 26, involution is complete, and the corpus luteum has become an inactive bit of scar tissue called the corpus albicans, right here. So as ovarian steroid secretes wanes, the pituitary inhibition is lifted, and the FSH level begins to rise again, starting the cycle all over again. Now this cycle, the ovarian cycle, repeats each month, but the follicle cycles begin their development prenatally, as much as 50 years earlier, and the oocyte that ovulates each month may have begun rippling about 2 to 4 months earlier. Okay, so all the information I was talking about with the different phases, what's happening with the follicle phase and the luteal phase, are all here. The 3 primary phases or steps of the ovarian cycle is the follicle, the ovulation, and our luteal phase. So everything I was talking about is all here. I just wanted to use the diagram just to show you guys, like I did in the last video, show you what's going on. So when we talk about the control of ovulation, we talk about dealing with the hypothalamus. We talked about the hypothalamus is going to increase this the GnRH hormone within itself. And when it increases, what happens is going to stimulate the LH and the FSH within the anterior pituitary gland to secrete. Correct? When it secretes, it stimulates the ovarian follicles and the four hormones that I talked about: the inhibin, the progesterone, the androgen, and the estrogen. Correct? So in return, when everything's developed and we're going through ovulation, or want to start ovulation, we have the maturing follicle here is going to secrete the estradiol. When the estradiol is secreted, it's going to basically tell the hypothalamus and the pituitary hormone to secrete more GnRH and to secrete the LH, FSH, those two hormones. So when those are secreted, it helps with completing the oocyte cycle within when it's in that phase 1, and the follicle will start to enlarge, and then we have ovulation occurring. Alright, so that's what's going to happen during the ovulation, and how the hypothalamus and pituitary gland works in conjunction with ovulation. So I'm going to skip ahead, and I'm going to go to, everything is here. I'm just skipping it over the words, and I'm going to go on to the menstrual cycle. What happens in there? Now, so with the menstrual cycle, we know it averages about 5 days in length. Some may be longer, but on average is about 5 days in length. And it consists of a buildup and a discharge of the endometrial tissue. And of course, it's divided into 4 stages. We have the menstrual phase, the proliferative stage, the secretory phase, and the premenstrual phase. When we look at the proliferative phase, during this phase we have a layer of endometrium tissue. Now, it was lost in the previous menstrual cycle here, previous menstrual phase, and it is actually in the process of being rebuilt. Now, at the end of the menstrual cycle, at the end of menstruation, the endometrium is about 0.5 millimeters thick, and it consists only of the stratum vellus. So it's very, very thin. Now, the development of the new cohort of follicles and their secretion of estrogen and stimulates these cells to divide and the blood vessels to regrow. Okay? Regenerating the functionalis. Now, by day 14 here, the endometrium is 2 to 3 millimeters thick. And we have the progesterone, which you see up here, which is dealing with hormones, is dealing with the thickness of the endometrium. The progesterone here, their receptors also appear on the endometrium cells due to the effects of the estrogen. Now, in this other phase here, the secretory phase, during this phase, the endometrium, it thickens even more, which is good. But as a result of secretion and the fluids of accumulation rather than mitosis. So it gets thicker because of secretion and fluid accumulation. Now, this phase extends from day 15 to about day 26. Now, the progesterone, which you see here, secreted by the corpus luteum, causes its endometrium glands to secrete glycogen and to grow wider, longer, and more coiled. Now, by the end of this phase, the endometrium is about 5 to 6 millimeters in thickness. Through this premenstrual phase, this phase comprises at least 2 days or so of the cycle, and is a period of endometrial degeneration. So it's the breaking down of this endometrial of our endometrial tissue. Now what happens now when there is no pregnancy, the corpus luteum starts to atrophy and progesterone levels drop. Now these changes, it triggers the contractions of these spiral arteries that we had here, these spiral arteries causing the endometrial ischemia. Now the premenstrual phase is also called the ischemic phase. Now ischemia brings on tissue necrosis and menstrual cramping. So if I ask you what brings on menstrual cramping, no, it's ischemia. Alright, so as the endometrium tissue degenerates, pools of blood start to accumulate in the functionalis. Now necrotic, which is dead endometrium, it falls away from the walls, mixes with the blood and serosus fluid, and forms the menstrual fluid. Now with this menstrual phase here, when enough menstrual fluid accumulates in the uterus, it begins to be discarded from the vagina for a period called the menstrual phase. Now the first day of discard marks day 1 of a new cycle. The average woman expels about 40 milliliters of blood and 35 milliliters of serosus fluid over a 5-day period, day 1 to day 5. Okay. Menstrual flow continues or contains fibrinolysis, so it does not clot. Clotting blood may indicate some type of urinary or uterine pathology. Alright, so that is the end of this menstrual cycle. Here we have everything here: menstrual cycle, our P phase, our S phase, and our other premenstrual phase. Everything is there. I just stuck with the diagram. And of course menstrual phase here. And these are the various changes that occur with the endometrium at the various phases. This is the thickest phase. We see it's very thick and spirally. This is when it's beginning to build back up. We have the secretions here that help with the thickness of the endometrium. And this is when you're beginning to have your menstrual cycle. This is what happens where it starts to shed away or degenerate, okay? So endometriosis is the growth of endometrial tissue outside of the uterus. The growth is often on peritoneum of the pelvic cavity or on the surface of the ovary. Now, only about 6 to 10% of women would be affected by this type of disorder, endometriosis. It's very painful, and sometimes it will cause infertility. Now, it's believed to result from retrograde menstruation, which is a backward flow of menstrual fluid that exits the uterine tube, which is not good. Okay, so that's the end. We just dealt with puberty and menstruation. So if you have any questions, you know what to do. Post it in Blackboard. Make sure you go ahead and look at video 3.